As we study the illegal trial and the broken 22 laws, bear in mind, 1, that God remains faithful to the Jews. Hallelujah. 2, their rejection of Jesus and desperation to do away with him by breaking the 22 rules was not only a result of their wanting to cling to authority, but also because of their fear of losing their land and temple, as we explained in an earlier video. And 3, remember, they were in the crosshairs of spiritual warfare. That's not an easy place to be. Satan knew that the Son of God had come and his position looked precarious. That is, Satan's position looked precarious. The destiny of the world was being decided at this time, 2,000 years ago nearly, in Judea, and the Jewish people were right there in the heart of it, surrounding, and there was Jesus, and the whole thing was a centre of spiritual activity. So we need to bear all these things in mind. There was a lot going on. All attention was being directed against the Jews of that generation. The effort of hell itself, really, to blind them to the truth about Jesus. Fourthly, finally, bear in mind that we all crucified him. Whether passers-by who mocked, the apathetic who couldn't care less, the religious, the Romans who hammered in the nails, the Jews who insisted that he be crucified, or the disciples who fled or denied him at his time of need. It was our sin that crucified Jesus. Were we there when they crucified the Lord? In one sense, we were. And had we been there, we would have been as bad, if not more so. Now, we begin by looking at the Garden of Gethsemane. We begin with the arrest of Jesus. I'll name the laws as we go through and how that law was broken. Law number 1, there was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was effected by a bribe. John 18:2 says, "And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples." Judas, you see, guided the authorities to the place where they could secretly arrest Jesus, the garden to the east of Jerusalem, known as Gethsemane or Gethsemane, the oil press. But Matthew 26:15 tells us, "And Judas said unto the chief priests, What will you give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they bargained with him for 30 pieces of silver." And so, remember, law number 1, there was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was effected by a bribe. Law broken. Law number 2, there was to be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. Why? This was to avoid the danger of conspiracy, which usually happens at night. Sunset occurred officially when 3 stars were visible in the Jewish way of thinking. So in the evening, 3 stars appear, night has begun. John 18 verse 3 says, "Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons." Now they needed lanterns and torches because it was night time. Law number 2 broken. Law number 3, judges or Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in the arrest. The reason being, they must remain neutral. Luke 22 verse 52, "And then Jesus said unto the chief priests and the captains of the temple and the elders which were come to him, Be ye come out as against a thief with swords and staves?" And so you see, it was the religious authorities who came to arrest him. That was the breaking of law number 3. Now we come to the trial. Law number 4, there were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. But John 18:12 says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first." So the trial began straight away. And yet there were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. That wasn't to happen for a number of hours yet. Law number 4 broken. Law number 5, there were to be no secret trials, only public trials. Again, this was to avoid, obviously, the possibility, the danger of conspiracy. John 18 verse 20 following says, "And Jesus answered him, Annas that is, I spoke openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. Now he was speaking to Annas, and he had gone to Annas's house. Annas wasn't even the high priest at the time. He was actually the father-in-law of the high priest. The high priest, you remember, was Caiaphas. Annas was the head of the household, but he was the great overseer, as it were. But he's not the high priest anymore. It's in his private house this is going on. There is to be no trials in a private house. No secret trials. Law number 5 broken. Law number 6, Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the Hall of Judgment, or what was known as the Hall of Hewn Stones, which is in the temple compound. Luke 22 verse 54 says, Then they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter followed afar off. So now he's gone from Annas's house to his son-in-law's house, Caiaphas. Again, a private house, not the proper place to conduct a trial. So law number 6 broken. Law number 7. The procedure was to be first the defence and then the accusation. That's how they were to run this business. First the defence, then the accusation. But Matthew 26 verse 59 says, Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. Jesus had no defence. He was allowed no room, no time to give his defence. Straight away came the accusation. This was breaking law number 7. Law number 8, and this is an interesting one. All may argue in favour of an acquittal, but all may not argue in favour of conviction. This is an interesting law, and again, it displays that tendency in Jewish thinking to err towards mercy. So if everybody convicted said this person's guilty, the Jews would back off and say that's not valid, because it would seem as though there was collusion between those that were convicted, you see. Again, it reminds us how merciful usually these things were conducted, but not for Jesus, of course. It was totally different. Remember, all the powers of darkness are present here, all wanting to destroy Jesus, wanting to do away with him. So Mark 14:55, looking at law number 8, the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death and found none. All, the key word there is all. They all convicted him, breaking law number 8. Law number 9. There were to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimony had to agree in every detail. Right? So 2 or 3 witnesses had to agree in every detail. Mark 14, verses 56 following says, For many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. Breaking law number 9. Law number 10. By the way, Jesus should have been released at that point. When the witnesses didn't agree, he should have been instantly released. But not so Jesus. Law number 10. There was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. Again, an interesting law. This was to avoid the possibility that the accused may be suicidal or trying to protect somebody else. So there are some interesting twists to this law. It's a very subtle thing. It's a very, as I said, the Jewish laws were very sophisticated. But again, they were broken for Jesus. Law number 10 then, no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. Matthew 26:62. The high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it that these have witnessed against thee? So he actually wants to shake a testimony, he wants to shake an accusation out of Jesus. So he wants Jesus to accuse himself. Law number 10 broken. Law number 11, the high priest was forbidden to rend his garments. Why? Because this was a sign of emotion, and the case must be decided on pure reason and facts. We don't want any emotion in this court. Matthew 26, though, verse 65 says, "Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy." That was law number 11 broken, but it also broke law number 12. Charges could not originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. They mustn't declare the verdict. It also broke law number 13, another law broken. In the same time, the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God, that is Yud-He Vav-He, God's personal name, Yahweh, itself was pronounced. And Jesus had said that they would see the Son of Man coming on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. He didn't mention the name Yud-He Vav-He, so it wasn't blasphemy anyway. And the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God, Yahweh, was used. So law number 13 broken. And before we move on, law number 14 was broken at the same time. They really went to town at this point. A person could not be condemned solely on the basis of his own words. Yet that's all they had left because the witnesses hadn't agreed. Therefore, they only had the words of Jesus. They tried to wring the words of Jesus out of him. Yet even if they had been able to do that, a person could not be condemned solely on the basis of his own words. But that made no difference. They broke that law, number 14. Law number 15. The verdict could not be announced at night, only in the daytime. Again, this was to avoid a rush to judgment. So mercy would be shown. There would be reason and mercy, and the whole thing would be done in a careful and thoughtful way. Matthew 26, verse 66 says, "What think ye? They answered and said, He's guilty of death. And they all clamoured for his death." And this verdict was given at night time, and it wasn't supposed to be. That was law number 15 broken. And it also broke law number 16. In cases of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but must be separated by at least 24 hours. This was to permit more time for evidence to arrive, which would favour or could favour the accused. Again, this idea of mercy to be shown to the accused. 24 hours for possible extra evidence to come in. Not so for Jesus, denied for him. Law number 16 broken. Law number 17 was also broken. Voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so that the young could not be influenced by the elders, whereas they all clamoured at the same time for his death. Law number 17 broken. Law number 18, the unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without plotting. Why do I say 23 to 71? Because 71 was the amount of men that were in the Sanhedrin, but they didn't all have to be there. The minimum was 23. So we've got somewhere between 23 and 70 odd men, maybe. Although I don't believe Nicodemus would have been there and Joseph of Arimathea wouldn't have been there. We've got a lot of men, at least 23. And they all agree together. They all agree together. Matthew 14, verse 64. "You have heard the blasphemy. What think ye?" And keyword here, all. And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. So a unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for all those men to agree. Law number 18, it was broken. This also broke law number 19. The sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. So there was to be 24 hours between the accusation and the verdict. And then there was to be a further 3 days between the actual verdict and the death and the execution. Not so for Jesus, breaking law number 19. Law number 20, judges were to be humane and kind. Matthew 14, verse 65. "And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands." This also broke law number 21. A person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten beforehand, again telling us how much mercy was usually shown in a Jewish court. And finally, The entire illegal procedure broke law number 22. No trials are allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or on a feast day. The trial of Jesus of Nazareth was illegal. The amazing wonder is that God transformed it into the fountainhead of salvation for all who put their trust in him. His was the hidden hand behind it all. By his illegal trial and crucifixion, we may be legally pardoned, assured that he who suffered unjustly will stand in our defence on that great day. The guiltless suffered unjustly that the guilty may be justified. Trust him. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this: God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah.